Today I want to talk about Rehaif versus United States, decided by the Supreme Court in April of 2019, a case which is proving to become one of the most important cases the Supreme Court has decided in recent years. The case involves Hamid Rehaif, who was a student that was studying in university here in the United States on a non-immigrant student visa. He essentially failed out of college, and as a result of that, lost his immigration status. Subsequent to failing out, he and a group of friends attended a gun range. He rented a firearm, used it at the gun range, turned it in, and did no harm to anyone. The government, though, found out that he had possessed this firearm at the gun range and charged him with a federal felony offense, unlawful alien in possession of a firearm, punishable under 18 U.S.C. 922 G5. If you were to look at that statute, 18 U.S.C. 922 G, it lists 9 different categories or statuses of persons who are not allowed to possess a firearm under federal law. The most common one being 922 G1, which is felon in possession of a firearm. If you look at the text of the statute, it talks about it prohibits knowingly possessing a firearm when you meet one of these status definitions, in this case, unlawful alien. Historically, we've done status disarmament at the federal system since 1938, and then really started to ramp it up in 1968, and then later in 1986, and then again in 1994. So that's kind of where you get this 922G list. Historically, all courts have held that the knowingly element, the mens rea, only applies to the possession element. So if the prosecution or the government's able to prove that you knowingly possess a firearm, and then prove that you meet one of these status definitions, then you're guilty of this federal crime punishable by up to 10 years in prison. In fact, the government was able to convict Mr. Rehaif, and he was ultimately sentenced to 18 months in prison. But at his trial, he raised his hand and said, "I think knowingly applies not only to possession, but also applies to prohibited status. In other words, I think the government has to prove not only that I knowingly possessed a firearm, which I certainly did, but also that I knew that I was an unlawful alien at the time I possessed it." He lost that argument at the district court, lost that argument at the Court of Appeals, but then the Supreme Court took another look at it. And when the Supreme Court evaluated this statutory text, the Supreme Court said, wait a minute, we've always applied this presumption of scienter, meaning this presumption that the mens rea, or culpable mental state, applies to every substantive element in an offense, unless congressional intent clearly demonstrates otherwise. Now, the court said, we know it doesn't apply to jurisdictional elements because those have nothing really to do with the mischief the statute was intended to prevent. But as to the substantive elements, when we look at this language, knowingly possess a firearm in being a prohibited person, there's no reason to deny the presumption in this case. So the big takeaway from Rehaif is really twofold. First, don't make assumptions about statutory interpretation. Really go back to those principles, in this case, presumption of scienter. Look at that mens rea, apply it to each substantive element, and see if there's any argument to be made. Second, what we think we know about the law is always subject to change. And you have to be able to anticipate it, and you have to be able to think creatively about it. In fact, just very recently, the Fourth Circuit in United States versus Medley has held that Rehaif error, meaning the government's failure to indict, failure to put on evidence as to knowledge of prohibited status, is reversible even on plain error review. Other courts, for example, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, has applied a harmlessness review to Rehaif error. Ultimately, this question may return to the United States Supreme Court.